Dreams. The history of aviation is a story of the constant fulfillment of dreams. In a few short years, one of man's oldest dreams has become a rapidly evolving reality. Frail, open cockpit planes made only of canvas and wood became sleek silver craft. And with the change came the era of commercial aviation. The biplane flying dawn patrol over the trenches of World War I became the jet fighter launched at night from a carrier's pitching deck. As pencil-slim rockets rose into the skies on trails of flame and smoke, the bonds of Earth's restraints were shattered and the final frontiers of space were crossed. James S. McDonnell and Donald W. Douglas, two of many men around the world who were deeply involved in this transformation of air and space. They helped shape a new era that changed our world for all time. It is September 1908 at Fort Myer on the bank of the Potomac River across from Washington, D.C. A group of people watch as Orville Wright prepares to demonstrate a plane that he and his brother had built for the Army Signal Corps. The new plane is the first ever to be ordered by the Army and is designed to be carried on a mule-drawn carriage. In the crowd stands a young man, Donald Douglas. He watches transfixed as the two brothers ready themselves for flight. As the sun sets, Wilbur Wright climbs on board and flies. It's now 1911, and Midshipman Donald Douglas sits in his room at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. From his window, he looks out on the river. Douglas watches and dreams. In 1912, he resigns from the Naval Academy and enrolls at MIT. He completes his degree in mechanical engineering. As war rages in Europe, Douglas is hired by Glenn L. Martin to design biplanes in Los Angeles. But as America enters the war, they have pitifully few trained pilots and ground crew. France had the world's largest air force with some 1,500 aircraft. Germany and Great Britain had about 1,000. America had 50 outdated aircraft and had already failed to visualize the importance of air power. Douglas becomes chief of an aeronautical group working for the Army Signal Corps, coordinating the country's aircraft makers and encouraging them to catch up with European technology. By the end of the war, they had only 740 planes in Europe, and only 196 were American-made. Douglas leaves Washington to rejoin Martin, seen here second from the right, where he helps develop a radically new plane, the famous Martin bomber. Times, however, are bad. To the rescue comes David R. Davis. From the newly formed Davis Douglas Company, established in the back of a barber shop on Pico Boulevard in Los Angeles, came a wood and canvas biplane powered by a war surplus engine. The plane is the Cloudster. In 1921, Davis Douglas becomes the Douglas Company. The Cloudster becomes a successful naval aircraft. Douglas has the capital to move to an abandoned movie studio on Wilshire Boulevard and is on his way to fulfilling a dream. It is 1923, and 24-year-old James Smith McDonnell Jr. earns his wings as an Army Service Second Lieutenant. It's at this time that Douglas and the newly formed Douglas Company plans an aviation feat of huge proportion. In June 1919, Alcock and Brown, two British aviators, had already crossed the Atlantic in a converted Vickers Vimy. 5 months later, the Smith brothers flew another to Australia, and the world had already begun to shrink. Backed by the US Army, plans were being made that would put the name of Douglas firmly on the world map with a record-breaking circumnavigation of the globe. Now designing with Henry Ford, it was ironic that the only link that McDonnell had with the man and the company that he, in later life, would absorb into his own empire was via the local cinema. The Army contract, which called for 5 planes designated DWC, was based on Douglas's successful post-war aircraft. On St. Patrick's Day, 1924, 4 of the 5 took off from Clover Field, Douglas's new base in Santa Monica, for Seattle, the official start point of the tour. But beforehand, to better acquaint foreign countries with the US, the aircraft were christened after prominent cities. On April the 6th, 1924, coincidentally Douglas's 32nd birthday, the 4 DCWs, the Seattle, Chicago, New Orleans and Boston, were re-equipped with pontoons, and at 8:47 a.m. in hazy weather, the first craft was airborne and heading northwest on the 600-mile first leg to Prince Rupert Island. It was not until 6 months later that the flyers were to return to Santa Monica. The coordination of the US services was nothing short of superb, but once last-minute replacements and adjustments were made, the flyers were on their own. It was to be one of the largest American flag-waving exercises seen to date, covering a total of 27,550 miles in just 175 days of actual flying time. The tour spread the name of American aviation to the far corners of the world. In Japan, old and young alike welcomed these unsung pioneers of early air travel. In China, age-old junks came face-to-face with the new world. It needs little imagination to see that from these humble beginnings were sown the seeds of a new form of global travel and a potentially new machine of war. Only 3 planes touched down at Cloverfield, the Chicago, the New Orleans, and the Boston II, the original Boston having ditched in the Atlantic. The Seattle had crashed near Alaska. In the vast crowd, the Prince of Wales is one of the many dignitaries waiting to greet the record breakers back to US shores. And as the planes returned to Seattle on September the 28th, completing history's first flight around the world, a proud mother stands beside Douglas. For McDonnell, the struggle continued. Having left Ford, he'd established James McDonald and Associates and was determined to build a kind of flying Ford. The result nearly killed him when a stabilizer failed on November the 15th, 1926. For Douglas, there seemed no way but up.
I joined the Douglas Company in May of 1925 after having gotten a master's degree in aeronautical engineering at MIT 4 years earlier. The intervening years were right after the First War, and there practically was no aviation industry in this country. They were then working on some seaplanes for the Navy. So I said, well, I'll take anything you've got. And so I worked in the shop on a bench, bending and filing steel fittings, corner fittings, for the tubular steel fuselages that they had then. Prior to that, Mr. Douglas, Doug as we got to know him, was really doing practically everything as acting chief engineer and as a salesman and as somebody had to go out and raise the money to pay us. And he did pretty well in everything except the latter. I was getting $24.75 a week, and after a little while I went in and talked to him. He had a little cubbyhole off the drafting room which had about 12 people in it, and he had this little cubbyhole by himself. And I went in and said, I wondered if you'd be interested in raising me a little bit. And he said, well, Ray, you're doing pretty well. And yeah, you want 30? I think we can give you 30. In fact, if you stay for a while, I think the future's unlimited.
And indeed it was, for the time being. Douglas continued to prosper after his move from Wilshire Boulevard to Clover Field. And close on the heels of his Navy successes, he decided to enter the world of civil aviation and build a small commercial flying boat, which he had already named the Sinbad. But the Sinbad was not to be the provider of the Golden Fleece. The sudden crash of the stock market and the onset of the Great Depression that followed took the lift out of the wings of the commercial airplane market. The 58 aircraft produced, now renamed the Dolphin, all but 11 were bought by the US military, with one exception. It was purchased by, of all people, William Boeing, Douglas's chief rival, to be used as an executive aircraft long before he had sold his controlling interest in the Boeing Company. For McDonald, the start of the Depression forced him to dissolve his company, and in 1933, 13 years after Donald Douglas left his job as chief engineer with Glenn Martin, the position was filled by another young man, still, in the face of it all, bent on success, James McDonald. First around the world, first the world round, soon became the motto of the rapidly developing Douglas Company. And despite the Depression, huge strides were being made in the development of military aircraft. It was at this time that the Dutch Fokker Aviation were experiencing problems with the tri-motor aircraft that they had supplied to Transcontinental and Western Air. And because of that, on August the 5th, 1932, Donald Douglas found in his mail one of the most important letters he was ever likely to receive.
J.H. Kindleberger, Dutch they used to call him, came in as chief engineer. He appointed me his assistant. And that was just after the plant had moved to Clover Field, which was about 1928 or 29. And then we got into a situation where we were interested in the commercial side of things, but we didn't have anything to go on that. And Boeing came out with a 247, which was a low-wing monoplane stress king construction, which was very much like we got into later. Jack Fry wrote this letter which wanted to know if we were interested, and he sent it to other people as well, in building maybe a dozen to start, tri-motored airplanes according to certain specifications. For instance, they wanted at least 10 passengers. They wanted a certain range. They wanted a certain altitude. But the main thing that they wanted was for it to be able to fly on one engine between the two highest airports on the TWA line. And that happened to be between Winslow and Albuquerque. And it had to be able to fly on one engine well above at least 6,000 feet, 6,000 or 7,000 feet to do that. When we got that letter, it didn't take us very long to decide that we wanted to go with 2 engines. The letter allowed 2 engines, but it actually asked for 3. So I think that that decision, and it was a crucial decision whether to go with 2 or 3, I had more to do with that than either Dutch or Doug. Anyway, I was chosen to go back to New York and talk to, Lindbergh, who was then a technical advisor to TWA, and the other TWA people there, which I did, along with Doug's assistant, Harry Wetzel. And I didn't know whether I was convincing Lindbergh or not, except that we were told, after we'd been there a few days, to go to Kansas City, wanted me to go to Kansas City and talk about the details of the specification, that they did want to contract with us. I didn't know at that time that they were also contracting with somebody who was going to build a 3-engine. They did, that was General Aviation, but they canceled that when they found out that the DC-1 was going to be a success.
Arthur Raymond's brainchild was to prove itself more than just a success. A Jack Fry letter was in fact the birth certificate of an entire Douglas commercial range, with the DC-3 becoming the world's most successful aircraft. On the 32nd anniversary, to the day, of the 1903 Wright brothers flight, the DC-3 made its maiden flight from Cloverfield, and an incredibly diverse life began. After Jack Fry's acceptance of the DC-1 and the updated DC-2 that followed, C.R. Smith, who had started American Airlines, saw a further potential for this craft that had reduced an arduous coast-to-coast journey to just 18 hours. By 1935, over 100 DC-2s had been produced when C.R. Smith suggested to Douglas that if he could expand the DC-2, he could come up with an aerial Pullman car. Other configurations would include a 14-passenger club lounge, which would accommodate the rapidly expanding requirements of the business traveler. A classic aircraft had been born that would enter the industry as a pioneer and blaze a trail that will stretch to the 21st century. In the beginning, it was the DC-2 that was being turned into the good ship Lollipop by the nation's Shirley Temple. But it was going to be Rosie the Riveter, a decade later, that would help win a war the storm clouds of which were already beginning to darken the skies of Europe. The DC-3 would become a C-47 and a multi-purpose military machine. Working round the clock at Cloverfield and at the newly acquired plants at Oklahoma and Long Beach, Douglas would build more than 10,000 aircraft. The result of Douglas's desire to enter the field of commercial aviation would result in the DC-3 eventually seeing action in 3 wars as a highly adaptable workhorse in Europe, Korea, and Vietnam as a weapons carrier, but also as a saver of lives with the aero medical units. Whether it was the DC-3, Goonie Bird, Skytrain, or C-47, its characteristic shape would be known the world over. As a carrier of troops, it would form the backbone of an awesome armada sent into Europe on D-Day. It would become a supplier of food, ammunition, and reinforcements, maintaining a constant supply drop lifeline. It would tow huge gliders to their silent rendezvous behind the enemy lines. And after the conflict, in a Cold War, it would prove itself dramatically during the Berlin blockade, providing a steady stream of supplies 24 hours a day to help relieve a deadly stranglehold. There would be hardly a place on Earth that would not have passed beneath the wings of a DC-3. She would be modified for peaceful roles of surveying and crop spraying. Competing with the jet age, it would become an aircraft that ground and flight crews would come to love, as over 2,000 entered passenger service around the world. It would become a legend on wings. Wings that would carry the childhood dreams of Douglas well into the 21st century. In 1939, Lambert Field in St. Louis became the major airline hub of the USA. It seemed a good place to start, and for McDonnell the future looked promising at last as the newly established McDonnell Aircraft Company opened for business in 2 rooms in a small office block at the airfield. The company was just 3 months old, with a staff of 15, when the war clouds exploded over Europe. During the war years that followed, McDonnell obtained small workshops all over St. Louis, and working in a disused Cadillac factory, he used to boast that he would build airplanes in the world's largest garage. His first year ended in 0 trading, 0 orders, and 0 profit. But the future was gradually brightening. With its humble beginnings, it's strange to think that the company that would one day swallow Douglas began as one of the myriad of its supplicants, and, ironically, after constantly competing for government contracts, his first was to build tail assemblies for Douglas and his DC-3. And then, in 1941, for McDonnell and his now enlarged workforce of 5,000, half of which were women, the gamble paid off. On the 29th of July, the U.S. Army Air Force contracted McDonnell to design and build a twin-engined interceptor designated P-67. It was to be a strange-looking piston-engined aircraft with the intended role of bomber destroyer. But it wasn't until late 1943 that this major step forward for McDonnell was wheeled from the Lambert Field hangar. It was even much later that the prototype, now designated XP-67, flew in January of 1944. Its strange shape and style, not vastly unlike the Lockheed's latter-day SR-71, was revolutionary for its day, utilizing as it did part of the fuselage to assist in lift. Its formidable armament of 6 37mm cannons portended a serious threat to enemy bombers. However, with its less than expected performance, interest in the XP-67, nicknamed the Bat, waned, as did the fear of enemy bombers. The second prototype was cancelled, and the original was destroyed by fire in September 1944. It was perhaps a climactic end to the only propeller-driven fighter program undertaken by McDonnell. But even as the Inferno consumed the Bat, another program was on the drafting board.
Our early products at McDonnell Aircraft Corporation were fighter airplanes, jet fighters to be exact. And the very first break that Mr. Mack got happened on New Year's Eve when he was working quite late in his office, which was characteristic of him. He was called by an admiral up in Washington during the war who said, "Can you come up here and meet with me tomorrow morning?" Mr. Mack said, "Absolutely," and he was on a DC-3 going up there the very next day. The admiral asked him, "Would you like to be the designer and builder of the first Navy carrier-based jet fighter?" Mr. Mack said, "Yes, sir." And he went home and came back one day later with a design which eventually resulted in our first contract for the Phantom One.
The design work was completed within a year, and later contracts were firmly placed for America's first jet fighter, designated XFD-1. Mr. Mack, as he was still known to the rapidly expanding workforce, always had a keen interest in animism and the spirit world that dated back to his days at Princeton. With this in mind, the FH-1 became the Phantom, and a long line of appropriately named aircraft began.
I'm standing here on the factory floor of McDonnell Aircraft Company, the same floor I walked across 40 years ago when I joined the company as a junior engineer. In those days, we had just completed delivering 60 Phantom Ones to the U.S. Navy, which was our Navy's very first carrier-based jet fighter.
100 Phantoms were ordered by the US government, but it was only the prototype that was built before the war ended. The Phantom One was destined never to see combat, but on July the 21st, 1946, it made history when, with the help of the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt, it became the first American jet aircraft to take off from an aircraft carrier. For Douglas, the war years had continued to further establish his company as a leader in military aviation. And now, as the decade of the 40s was drawing to a close, a new competitor for government contracts was on the horizon. The remaining 60 production aircraft began to roll off the production line in January of 1947 and became the first all-jet Navy fighter squadron. And even as they began to enter service, McDonnell was hard at work on a successor. Shortly after the first flight of the Phantom in 1945, the US government expressed great interest in the new McDonnell design that outwardly resembled its predecessor, but in performance was vastly different. On January the 11th, 1947, the XF-2H was unveiled and made its first flight, powering itself into the air with twice the thrust of the Phantom. Jet engine technology was now improving at an incredible pace, as the Banshee, as it became known, entered combat service in 1951 as principal fighter aboard the 7th Fleet carriers for the duration of the Korean War.
The Banshee was a twin-engine jet fighter for the U.S. Navy, carrier-based, and for those days, very high-performance machine. It was one of the biggest thrills I ever had, stepping into that from a P-51 and flying something that would really move, go to very high altitudes. Of course, it was still subsonic, but I'll say in the high subsonic region.
For McDonnell, his dream was at last being fulfilled, as he ranked amongst America's great aircraft builders. Even as the Banshee was flying its first missions in Korea, its successor was being rolled off the production line at St. Louis.
That was called the Demon, and that was a pretty good name for it because it had demonic tendencies. It was the only single-engine airplane we ever built, and probably will be the only single-engine airplane we will ever build. Had a brand new engine in it, and it was a brand new airframe. You put those two together at the same time, you're asking for a lot of development headaches.
Success followed success, and although the future seemed boundless, and indeed it was, Mr. Mack never lost sight of the value of his workforce and the unique relationship he had developed with them. With the cessation of hostilities, the military immediately cancelled orders for the C-54 Skymaster that Douglas had been building in large numbers. Even worse for Douglas was that the US government put the 4-engine Skymasters on the open market for sale to the highest bidder, and it was possible to buy one for as low as $10,000. On February the 15th, 1946, another member of the DC family was born, when the DC-6 made its maiden flight. The 6, like the 3 before her, was to dominate the world's skies as a common carrier. History has a way of repeating itself, and again it was C.R. Smith of American Airlines that suggested to Douglas that a bigger DC-6 would enable him to beat the competition and operate the first coast-to-coast non-stop service. Wright's new 27-cylinder engine was at this time being offered to Douglas for evaluation, and it wasn't long before it became apparent that to utilize the engines on the DC-6 would result in a much greater range and payload. It seemed the simplest way of giving CR what he wanted. It was precisely what he wanted. The DC-7 flew for the first time on May the 18th, 1953, and entered service 6 months later. By 1955, the advanced DC-7C was flying. They called it the 7 Seas, an apt name, for it became the first truly intercontinental airliner. For McDonnell, it was a time of experimentation. Projects were being developed and tested. One of the strangest was an idea based on utilizing the formidable range of the Convair B-36. It was extremely unorthodox and involved this tiny parasite fighter being slung on a trapeze under the wing. During the 7 test flights, the XF-85 Goblin achieved a maximum endurance of 109 minutes. But already doubts had crept into the minds of the military. Although the idea worked, retrieving the fighter in combat conditions proved to be no small feat. Bearing this in mind, the Air Force canceled the project after the construction of only 2 aircraft. It had cost them well over $3 million for research, development, and test evaluation, and it marked the end of McDonnell's first post-war Air Force contract and the end of the smallest fighter ever built. Even with the Goblin project well underway, McDonnell still pursued the Air Force for a more conventional fighter contract. The Phantom and Banshee programs were working out very well with the Navy, and it seemed a logical step to approach the Air Force's rapidly developing requirements based on intelligence coming back from the Korean conflict. Similar to the Navy's Banshee, 2 prototypes of a new aircraft were ordered by the Air Force, and under the designation of F-88 Voodoo, the first flew in October 1958.
I can tell you when that thing moved out, nothing would stay up with it. In fact, on the very first flight of that airplane, I took it supersonic. Now, that's the first time that's ever been done.
It was to prove to be one of the most successful fighter aircraft programs and was to span, in one form or another, the entire decade of the 60s. By now, in the middle of the 50s, stretched to his own personal financial limits, Douglas had to go it alone. Boeing, who had just secured a $100 million contract to develop a jet tanker, could utilize knowledge gained. But there would be no financial help from the military to assist development of Douglas's first jet airliner. If Douglas wanted to maintain a reputation in the commercial field, something had to be done, and done soon. More than $1 billion of private monies was poured into a new jetliner. But would it pay off? That nobody could tell. In St. Louis, McDonnell also had plans to enter the world of commercial aviation, and in fact had begun to develop for government evaluation an aircraft originally designed as a utility cargo transport aircraft, designated 119. Later, to commemorate the company's second 20 years of business, Mr. Mack suggested that it be redesignated the 220. The 220 was rolled out of the St. Louis factory on January the 30th, 1959. It proved not to be a success. In fact, it lost out to Lockheed and its entry for the government evaluation, the Lockheed Jetstar. Having tried to sell the aircraft as a trainer and subsequently as a small business aircraft, which incidentally was the first to receive a Class 1 license for this purpose, McDonnell, with no direct sales, bowed out of the commercial aircraft business. But as it was eventually to transpire, only for the time being. His company continued to grow in St. Louis, and now, being ever diverse, McDonnell had the opportunity to tackle the new challenge.
Later on, during the late 50s, we got involved in space. We designed and built the first Mercury capsule, the first Gemini, Skylab, and eventually we got into the Apollo and the shuttle. Mr. Mack was completely wrapped up in the space program. He really loved all the astronauts, and they loved him.
For Douglas in California, there was to be another, more unexpected problem on the horizon. His new jet airliner became a huge success, and indeed, the DC-8 became, as had its forebears, one of the world's most prolific airliners. The first DC-8 went on the assembly line in February 1957, and the last came off in May 1972. There had been 556 models made, which served the airlines of the world. For its day, until the advent of the wide-bodied Lockheed L-1011, Boeing 747, and the last in the DC series, the 10, the DC-8 was the biggest jet airliner flying. Some say that it was this program that began the steady decline in the financial stability of the Douglas Aircraft Company. Some say it was an acute management problem. The company had reported earnings of over $14 million in 1965. Both commercial and military projects were doing well. Sales of the DC-8 and the 9 that followed were also doing well. There were to be new versions of the Skyhawk for the Navy. There were also plans to introduce a new member of the DC family, the 10. The picture was bright and clear. But then suddenly things started to take a turn for the worse. The picture became fussy and blurred. By June of 1965, there were rumblings and rumors that Douglas was losing money at an alarming rate. Suddenly they showed losses of $3 million. By the end of the year, it would be 16. Forecasts indicated it might reach $75 million. The word was out. Douglas was unbankable. What had happened? How could a company of over 50 years standing, a pioneer in aviation and an example of the fulfillment of the American dream, collapse like a house of cards in a matter of months? Rapid expansion to accommodate increased orders for the DC-8 and 9. New and separate production lines, the lack of skilled workers for the new technology jobs, millions spent on special training, long delays, disappointed customers holding back monies, contractors and subcontractors already hard-pushed manufacturing hardware, engines, tires, and components for the war in Vietnam, all contributed to the fact that Douglas could hardly meet the demands of a payroll. In St. Louis, McDonnell by now had entered the space race, and great strides were being made that further established the man and his company. It was a time when global attention was focused on man into space and the men that put him there. For old Mac, it was a moment of crowning glory.
Number now full of meaning for our team. Number 13 came home to St. Louis last night. Number 13 came home, but only to stay briefly, because she has now made history and under her christened name, Friendship 7, what turned this hardware into the glorious Friendship 7 Epic of America was the superb pioneering astronaut who breathed the spirit of America into this vehicle as he rode her, subdued her, and brought her home with masterful skill. Therefore, joyous we are today to have with us John Glenn, who stands here representative of the 7 astronauts for whom Friendship 7 was named. This astronaut, this great American, needs no introduction to you.
Mr. Mack paid special tribute to all the engineers. With all due respect to all the engineers, it took a lot of you that I'm looking at here today to put the actual hardware together. And I know that the way it was put together and the way the mission worked out, there was more went into it than just a wage that you were earning here in the plant. Your hearts went into it as ours did down at the Cape, too. For that, I thank you very much.
Although having now broadened his horizons into space, McDonnell saw the opportunity to once more enter the world of commercial aviation, and it was with this in mind that the first moves were made to merge with the floundering Douglas Company. On April the 26th, 1967, McDonnell was notified by the Justice Department that approval had been given for the merger. The amalgamation was consummated on Friday, April the 28th, 1967, and the Douglas Company ceased to exist in its original form.
Mr. Mack had hoped to get into the commercial aircraft business. And in 1967, we merged with Douglas, which realized a dream that he had had ever since he started in 1939. This combined, in his opinion, and in mine too, two very excellent companies that complemented each other in many, many ways. First of all, of course, Mr. Mack realized his dream of getting into commercial aircraft. Douglas was the preeminent builder, designer, and in my opinion still is, of commercial aircraft. They also had a very fine missile and space division which melded very nicely with our own astronautics company, which also built missiles. And in addition to that, we of course had our very profitable and successful jet fighter line. So the two companies melded together very well in their product line. Mr. Mack had a personal touch that he used throughout his career. He liked to talk to people all up and down the line, and he did so often and frequently. And he also had a habit of calling everyone on the public address system and giving them the latest word about where we stood in our contracts and our business and how we were doing as a corporation. He always used to start it by, "This is Mack calling all personnel. This is old Mack calling all personnel." And then he'd give the story.
Throughout his life, James S. McDonnell never lost sight of the importance of the individual. He had a style of leadership unique to the American way of life, and was loved by all who knew him and the 80,000 people that worked for him. He died on 22nd of August, 1980. For Donald Douglas, his life was one of epic proportion. The boy whose dreams were sparked by the birth of aviation became the man, perhaps more than any other, that breathed life into aviation industry. Until his death on February the 1st, 1981, he remained honorary chairman of the giant McDonnell Douglas Corporation.
And now, some extracts from the next exciting episode of Wings Over the World.